Picture an island in the middle of the ocean. The nearest inhabited land is 2,000 kilometers away. This is the most isolated inhabited place on the planet. On this small patch of land, just 163 square kilometers, people managed to carve and raise nearly 1,000 stone giants weighing up to 80 tons, without wheels, without metal, without draft animals. And then it all disappeared. The forests, the statues stopped appearing. The population, by some estimates, dropped by 90%. What actually happened on Easter Island? Who were the Rapa Nui people? Why did they build the Moai? And did they really destroy their own civilization, as textbooks claimed for decades? In this video, we'll cover it all, from the first settlers' ocean voyage, to a mysterious script that still can't be deciphered, to a birdman cult, and finally to the real cause of the catastrophe, which turns out to be nothing like what the textbooks said. Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, as its own people call it, is a volcanic island in the southeastern Pacific Ocean. It formed from the eruption of three volcanoes roughly 300,000 years ago: Poik, Reno Kau, and Reno Raraku. These three volcanoes still shape the island's triangular outline today. The most striking thing about this island is its isolation. The nearest inhabited land, Pitcairn Island, lies more than 2,000 kilometers away. The coast of Chile is nearly 3,700 kilometers away. For comparison, that's roughly the distance from Kyiv to Lisbon, except instead of land, it's open ocean the entire way. The island was settled by Polynesians who arrived on double-hulled canoes sometime between 800 and 1200 CE. The exact date is still debated among archaeologists, with estimates varying by centuries depending on the dating method used. It was an extraordinary feat of navigation. People crossed thousands of kilometers of open ocean without a compass, guided by the stars, the direction of swells, the color of the water, and the flight patterns of birds. Polynesian navigation is considered one of the greatest seafaring achievements before the era of modern instruments. According to the Rapa Nui's own oral traditions, the island was discovered by a chief named Hotu Matue, who sailed from a homeland the islanders call Hiva, possibly one of the Marquesas Islands, though its exact location has never been firmly established. When the first settlers landed, they found a very different landscape than the one we see today. The island was covered in a dense forest of palm trees, which paleobotanists believe resembled the Chilean wine palm, one of the largest palm species in the world, capable of reaching 25 meters in height. This forest was home to millions of nesting seabirds. The island was, according to researchers, one of the richest seabird nesting sites in the entire Pacific. The Polynesians who landed on Rapa Nui brought with them the typical toolkit of Pacific Island settlers. Chickens, rats, whether intentionally or accidentally is still debated, taro root, sweet potato, yams, sugarcane, and bananas. And they began building a society that, over several centuries, would create one of the most enigmatic cultural phenomena in human history. The society organized itself into clans, each of which controlled a wedge-shaped section of the island stretching from the coast to the center, giving every clan access to both marine and land resources. According to legend, the island was divided into two major confederations of clans, and this division is tied to one of the island's most famous legends. One of the most famous oral legends of Easter Island describes a conflict between two groups, the so-called long ears, Hanau Eep, and short ears, Hanau Momoko. According to tradition, the long ears wore heavy ornaments that stretched their earlobes, and it was supposedly they who directed the construction of the statues, using the short ears as labor. The legend tells how the short ears eventually rebelled against the long ears. The long ears were lured into a ditch filled with brushwood, which was then set on fire, and nearly the entire long ears clan perished in the flames, with only a few managing to escape. For a long time, this legend was interpreted literally as historical evidence of a social conflict, an uprising against an elite group that had been exploiting ordinary islanders for grandiose building projects. Some researchers even linked the legend to accounts of separate waves of settlement on the island. Modern anthropologists treat the story more cautiously. It's likely not a literal historical event, but a symbolic legend about social stratification and the struggle for resources and power, a theme that recurs regularly in the oral traditions of many Polynesian islands. Still, the mere existence of such a legend suggests that Easter Island society was not uniformly harmonious. It contained hierarchy, competition for status, and, likely, real internal conflicts over resources long before Europeans ever arrived. Now, the reason the whole world knows Easter Island, the Moai. These are monolithic statues, carved mostly from volcanic tuff at the Rongorongo quarry. In total, the island holds roughly 900 statues in various states of completion. The tallest completed statue stands over 10 meters high, while one unfinished statue, still lying in the quarry, would have reached an estimated 21 meters, the height of a 7-story building. It was likely never going to be movable, which may be exactly why work on it was abandoned. For a long time, Moai were thought to be simply heads sticking out of the ground. In reality, they are torso statues. Most of them have full bodies that were simply buried by volcanic ash and centuries of erosion. Excavations of statues long assumed to be just heads revealed complete torsos with intricate details, including arms folded across the stomach and carved ornamentation. Many statues also carried another element often overlooked: puceo, cylindrical top knots, made of red volcanic stone quarried separately at Punapau. The red color likely carried symbolic weight, associated with mana or spiritual power and status. Placing a multi-ton puceo atop a multi-ton statue was, on its own, a separate engineering challenge. The eyes of the statues were also carved separately, from white coral and obsidian or red scoria for the pupils, and inserted only during a special ceremony when the statue was erected on its platform and formally brought to life, gaining the ability to watch over its clan. Until that moment, a moai was considered simply stone, not yet the embodiment of an ancestor. Why did the Rapa Nui pour such enormous resources into these statues? The current archaeological consensus is this: moai represent deified ancestors, clan chiefs. They were placed on special stone platforms called ahu and were believed to protect and watch over their living descendants. Tellingly, almost all moai originally faced inward, toward the villages rather than out to sea, as if standing guard over their people. The one notable exception is a group of 7 statues at Ahu Akivi, which face the ocean. According to legend, they represent the first scouts Hotu Mai, sent out to find the island. The single greatest unsolved mystery is how the islanders moved statues weighing up to 80 tons a distance of up to 18 kilometers from the quarry to the coast, without wheels or draft animals. For years, the prevailing theory was that statues were dragged on wooden sledges or rollers, and that this was supposedly what consumed most of the island's forest. But in 2012, archaeologists Terry Hunt and Carl Lippo proposed a different hypothesis based on the Rapa Nui's own oral traditions. The statues walked. More precisely, they were rocked side to side using ropes tied to 3 points around the statue's base, causing it to lurch forward the way a person might walk a heavy refrigerator or wardrobe across a room. The researchers even tested this method with a full-scale replica statue weighing about 5 tons, and a team of 18 people managed to move it hundreds of meters within minutes using exactly this rocking technique. This detail matters because it undermines the older narrative we're about to cover. If the statues didn't require massive amounts of timber for dragging, then the theory of large-scale deforestation purely to transport statues looks far less convincing. Beyond the statues, Easter Island left behind another mystery, the Rongorongo script. This is a system of symbols carved into wooden tablets, discovered by missionaries in the second half of the 19th century. Today, just over 20 authentic artifacts bearing these symbols are known, scattered across museums around the world. Rongorongo is unique in that it's likely the only writing system to have arisen independently in Oceania before contact with literate cultures from outside. Though some researchers debate whether it emerged before or after brief contact with Europeans in the 18th century, possibly as a reaction to seeing Spanish-written documents. The problem is that Rongorongo has never been deciphered by anyone, and the reason is closely tied to the events we'll cover in the section on Peruvian slave raids. Nearly all the priests and scholars who knew how to read these symbols died or were kidnapped into slavery in the 1860s, taking the knowledge of how to read the script with them. A handful of attempts by local islanders to read the tablets for European researchers in the 19th century were likely closer to reconstructions from memory or even improvisation than genuine reading of the symbols. Today, Rongorongo remains one of the few writing systems in the world that has never been deciphered, alongside scripts like Proto-Elamite or the symbols of the Indus Valley Civilization. Here's another detail often left out of Easter Island stories. At some point, roughly from the 16th century onward, the island's culture underwent a significant transformation. The construction of new Moai gradually ceased, and the ancestor cult was replaced by a new religious and political institution, the cult of Tangata Manu, the birdman. Each year, the island's clans competed for the title of birdman for the coming year. The competition took place in the ceremonial village of Orongo, perched on the rim of the Reno Cal volcano crater. Representatives of each clan, young men chosen by the chiefs, had to descend a steep, treacherous cliff to the ocean, swim to a small islet called Motu Nui a few hundred meters offshore, wait there for the arrival of sooty terns, seabirds that came each year to lay eggs, find the season's first egg, and then return with that egg by the same route, swimming back and climbing the cliff again. The winner delivered the egg to his sponsoring chief, who was granted the sacred title of Tangata Manu for the year, along with considerable political power over the island. This competition fused spiritual tradition with fierce political rivalry between clans, and likely partly replaced the older tradition of statue building as a way to display a clan's status and mana. This shift from the age of Moai to the age of Tangata Manu is itself important evidence. The island's society wasn't simply collapsing into chaos. It was transforming, finding new forms of governance and ritual. It's another argument against the oversimplified picture of a total societal collapse before European contact. Now for the story that's been told for decades, one you've probably heard before. In the 1990s, geographer Jared Diamond popularized, in his book on why civilizations collapse, a version of events now known as the Rapa Nui ecocide. The gist: the island's population grew, the statues grew larger and more ambitious, effectively becoming a status competition between clans. To transport these statues, islanders allegedly deforested the island on an industrial scale. On top of that, the palms were used for building canoes, housing, and fuel. As the forest vanished, seabird nesting grounds disappeared, soil erosion destroyed the fertile topsoil, and crop yields collapsed. Without timber for large canoes, the Rapa Nui lost the ability to go out to sea and fish. Resources ran out, and famine, interclan warfare, and, according to legend, even cannibalism followed. Peak population estimates under this version reached as high as 15,000 people, and by the time of European contact in 1722, when the Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen discovered the island, only a few thousand exhausted survivors remained among the toppled remnants of their former grandeur. This story became one of the most popular metaphors in environmental writing. Easter Island as a warning to humanity. A closed ecosystem, limited resources, self-destruction through greed and short-sightedness. It appears in school textbooks, documentaries, even in political speeches about climate change. The problem is that over the past 15 to 20 years, this version has started to fall apart under the weight of new archaeological evidence. Let's start with who actually destroyed the forest. Research by botanists, including work by archaeologist Terry Hunt, has shown that a huge role in the disappearance of the palm forest was played not directly by humans, but by Polynesian rats, which the islanders brought with them, whether intentionally, as a food source, or accidentally, as stowaways on canoes. On an island with no natural predators for rats, their population exploded. Analysis of fossilized palm nuts shows gnaw marks from rats on nearly every specimen found. The rodents simply prevented the forest from regenerating naturally, eating the seeds faster than they could sprout. Next is the question of population size. Analysis of the number of stone planting platforms, so-called manavai, and stone mulching fields shows that the Rapa Nui developed a highly efficient farming system, well adapted to the island's poor volcanic soil. Stone mulch protected crops from wind and evaporation, boosting fertility. This contradicts the picture of a starving, deteriorating society. Even more telling, analysis of human skeletal remains from archaeological digs shows no widespread signs of starvation or violent death in the period leading up to European contact, signs we would expect to find under a collapse scenario involving warfare and cannibalism. And perhaps most importantly, current archaeological estimates, including the work of Hunt and Lippo along with later genetic studies, suggest the island's population never reached the dramatic figure of 15,000 that Diamond claimed. More realistic estimates put the peak population at 3,000 to 6,000 people. That means there was no sharp population collapse before European contact. Instead, numbers stayed relatively stable for centuries, and the society continued building statues up until roughly the 17th century. Further confirmation came from an unexpected source, the written records of the earliest European visitors themselves. When Jacob Roggeveen landed on the island in April 1722, his journal described the islanders as physically robust, well-fed people, and the island itself as having crops and gardens under cultivation. That's hardly consistent with the image of a society that had just endured catastrophic famine and civil war. Later, in 1774, the island was visited by the legendary Captain James Cook. His crew did note that some statues had already been toppled by that point, and the island appeared poorer than it had during the first European contact. But researchers today link this not to an internal collapse predating contact. but rather to the aftermath of contact itself. Sporadic clashes with European sailors, diseases that had already begun spreading before Cook's visit, and possibly droughts. In 1786, the island was visited by an expedition led by French explorer Jean-François de la Pérouse, whose records also describe islanders meeting Europeans, with some statues already in a state of decline. So yes, the forest really did disappear. That much is confirmed by both pollen analysis and fossil remains. But the cause of that disappearance was a combination of human deforestation and an uncontrolled rat population, not evidence of a society destroying itself through reckless waste. And most importantly, a sharp demographic collapse before Europeans ever arrived, in the form Diamond described, is now heavily in doubt based on the available evidence. The toppling of statues and the gradual weakening of the society appear to have happened after contact with the outside world began, not before it. If it wasn't self-destruction, then what actually happened to the Rapa Nui people? The answer: contact with the outside world proved far more devastating than any internal crisis ever could have been. When Raghaveen arrived in 1722, followed by later European expeditions, they brought diseases the islanders had no immunity to whatsoever: smallpox, tuberculosis, sexually transmitted infections. An isolated population that had gone without contact with outside pathogens for 1,000 years turned out to be catastrophically vulnerable. Much has happened to indigenous peoples across the Americas after Columbus's arrival. But the most devastating blow came in the 1860s, when Peruvian slave traders launched a series of raids on the island. Over the course of a few years, roughly half the island's population was kidnapped and shipped off to work on Peru's guano mining operations and plantations, including the island's king and a significant share of its priests and Rongorongo scholars, which is precisely why, as mentioned earlier, that script remains undeciphered to this day. Conditions at the guano mines were so brutal that the vast majority of the kidnapped Rapa Nui died within just a few years. When international pressure, largely from French missionaries and diplomats, eventually forced the return of a small group of survivors, only a few dozen people, they brought smallpox back with them, which then devastated the remaining islanders, who had no immunity of their own. By 1877, the island's population had fallen, by some estimates, to just over 100 people, the lowest point in the island's entire recorded history, a catastrophe far more severe than any hypothetical ecological collapse. It was slave raiding and imported disease, not deforestation carried out by the islanders themselves, that caused Easter Island's true demographic catastrophe. The forest disappeared gradually over centuries alongside a relatively stable functioning society, while the population collapsed with brutal speed only after contact with the outside world in the 18th and 19th centuries. In 1888, Chile annexed the island. For a long time afterward, the Rapa Nui were effectively confined to a small fenced-off area around the village of Rongorongo, while the rest of the island was leased out as a sheep ranch to a Scottish company. Only in the second half of the 20th century, after years of struggle, did the Rapa Nui begin reclaiming control over their own land and gain full Chilean citizenship rights. Today, roughly 8,000 people live on Rapa Nui, many of them descendants of those who survived the catastrophe of the 19th century. The island is part of Chile, but the Rapa Nui hold a special status and continue an active struggle for greater autonomy and the return of ancestral land. One of the most prominent modern disputes involves the return of artifacts held in Western museums. The most famous case is the statue Hoa Hakananaye, taken by a British crew aboard the ship Topaz in 1868 and now housed in the British Museum in London. The Rapa Nui community has spent years demanding its return, describing the statue not merely as a museum exhibit, but as a living embodiment of an ancestor that needs to come home. Tourism has become the backbone of the island's economy, with tens of thousands of visitors arriving each year to see the Moai. This creates a difficult tension. Tourism brings income the community depends on, but it also puts pressure on the island's fragile ecosystem and on the archaeological sites themselves, some of which are suffering erosion from the constant flow of visitors. The story of Easter Island isn't a parable about people destroying themselves through greed, as it was long portrayed. It's the story of a society that found a remarkable way to adapt to one of the harshest environments on the planet, developed a unique writing system, built a sophisticated religious and political structure, and was ultimately devastated by forces that came from outside, once the wider world finally found it. Perhaps the real warning of Easter Island isn't about the dangers of reckless resource use. It's about just how vulnerable even the most ingenious societies can be when they come into contact with forces they never could have anticipated and had no way to defend against. And if you enjoyed this video, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments what happened to topic you'd like to see next.